So you are an assistant professor of chemical and environmental engineering at the University of California, Riverside, with many research interests, including environmental justice. Can you talk a little bit about what environmental justice and racism is and why it's important?
Absolutely. Thank you, Maddie and Paula, for inviting me to be part of your podcast. I'm happy to talk to your audience, your viewers, about my research and how my research relates to environmental justice. So, first of all, environmental justice is a movement. It's a movement to protect vulnerable communities from being inundated with environmental hazards, such as Superfund sites, landfills, and various industrial facilities that emit toxic pollutants. And so, as a history, in the environmental justice movement was catalyzed and started by a former UCR professor, Dr. Robert Bullard. He was a professor of sociology in the early 1990s. And he did research that identified the disproportionate existence of environmental hazards in minority communities. And he found that this was a pattern across the United States. And so his work highlighted that these vulnerable communities were very likely to have polluting facilities near their communities. And so it's really important to understand and highlight these patterns because they have very serious implications for public health, for education, and for economics. Okay, so if I'm allowed to elaborate on that, I'd like to.
Yes, please.
So there have been numerous research studies as well as anecdotal evidence that shows that living near an environmentally hazardous facility or near an interstate or a roadway is linked to an increased risk of acquiring an infectious or a non-infectious disease. And this inherently creates a disproportionate health burden on these vulnerable populations near hazardous facilities. So in addition to public health, environmental justice creates a problem for disproportionate quality of education. The usual thought about minority communities and education is that they don't have great schools, they don't have great facilities, but this actually is not the entire, it's not the entire case. So you have to consider the fact that the children that are living near these facilities in these environmental justice neighborhoods, they may become more sickly with chronic illnesses such as asthma. And this actually increases school absences. And this is what creates the learning disadvantage for those students, is being pulled out of school because of the diseases associated with living in environmental justice communities. And the third point I want to hit on, in addition to health and education, is economics. And so environmental justice has implications, or environmental injustices has implications for economics. For instance, property values near these facilities, as well as resale of these properties, is severely impacted due to the presence of the facilities, as no one wants to live there. So environmental justice impacts are multidimensional, and they have long-term health and socioeconomic consequences simply because you grew up in an environmentally hazardous neighborhood.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's very interesting you say that, because I know that's a huge issue currently here in the IE in relation to, warehousing, which kind of leads into my next question. You're also the principal investigator at the UCR Air Quality Modeling and Exposure Laboratory. As I said, the Inland Empire is known for having poor air quality for a multitude of reasons, including truck traffic from Los Angeles and the large presence of warehousing in the IE. Can you explain the cause and effect of the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Truck traffic is an issue of contention as of late, for a very good reason. But first, I'd like to say, just as you mentioned, there are several sources of air pollution in the Inland Empire. However, it is true that a large fraction of these pollutants are emitted from heavy-duty vehicles, okay? The other sources may include industrial facilities, small manufacturing shops, as well as off-road equipment like construction equipment, garden equipment, etc. So going back to trucks, as far as the relationship between Los Angeles and the Inland Empire, first off, these truck trips, they actually originate at the ports, okay? This is where goods are imported into the country. And so from the ports, the goods are moved by heavy duty truck from the port to warehouses in the Inland Empire. And from there, they are distributed to the rest of the country or locally in California. So as it would have it, as warehousing is expanding in the Inland Empire, the truck trips to and from these facilities will also increase, okay? So I should note that these heavy-duty trucks, the engines within the heavy-duty trucks are a lot cleaner than they used to be in terms of NOx and particulate matter pollution. But I should note that recent research has shown that this pollution removal efficiency, it has been found to decrease. This efficiency decreases in stop and go traffic. So what does this mean for the IE? Well, when our highways are at normal commuter capacity, this puts a strain on that pollution removal efficiency. So as we increase warehousing, we're increasing truck trips. It is also projected that the population and vehicle miles traveled in the South Coast is going to increase as well. Therefore, it's only logical to think that truck traffic and pollution will increase as well.
Wow, the environment, from the little I know about it, I'm very interested, but it seems very complicated. And unfortunately, a lot of human life aspects negatively affect the environment, which we may not even think about or consider. I remember when my grandma, told me, we used to burn our trash, and that now, we just look back and go, oh my goodness, no way, how could you? So, I feel like we're just learning more and more and more as we live. And I know you conduct a lot of research, and it is to my understanding that you have worked with GIS mapping. This is a very up-and-coming field within public policy, political science. For those listening who may not know, can you explain what GIS is and how it has played a role in your research of environmental justice?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I get into the question, I'd like to give a shout out to the Center for Geospatial Sciences, directed by Serge Ray and Eli Knapp. I'm also an affiliate faculty member of CGS, so I'm excited to see its growth. And you can see that there is a tremendous need for GIS capabilities for public policy research, as well as environmental research. So you asked me about what GIS is and how it's played a role in my research. Well, first of all, GIS is an acronym, okay? It stands for Geographic Information System. And there are several GIS products that are used for mapping and visualization of the Earth and its features, okay? We can use GIS to map man-made features as well, okay? A couple of the popular software products are ArcMap by Esri, and there is an open source GIS software called QGIS, okay? For those of us that want a slightly more affordable option for GIS-based research, okay? And so just a little bit more technical background. So this GIS mapping and visualization is actually facilitated by the Global Positioning System. And this is a series of satellites that provide the coordinates for our features of interest. So everything is based on a latitude and a longitude. So in terms of the use of GIS for my research, I actually collect GPS positioning for alongside air quality and exposure measurements. And I collect this for people that agree to be part of my air pollution exposure studies. And so once we collect this information, we can use GIS to find the spatial patterns in these personal measurements of air quality and location. And so as an example, in my recent pilot study, we actually used a GIS spatial clustering algorithm to mine hundreds of thousands of these measurements. And we wanted to find any trends in people's PM2.5 exposure as a function of their residential location. And so this pilot study had 17 participants from 4 different cities, including San Bernardino, Riverside, Moreno Valley, and Redlands, okay, as well as Yucaipa. Forgive me if I repeated any of those cities. And so what we found was that, of course, as expected, and what we also see in the existing literature is that residential location was a proxy for exposure risk. So based on where a person lived, it was synonymous with where they live as an average exposure. However, what we found, which was very interesting, is that actually personal behaviors and personal choices, they play a very important role when it came to people's short-term exposures. But indeed, those short-term exposures were also slightly higher for our environmental justice communities of San Bernardino compared to the others. And so GIS enabled us to do this. It enabled us to visualize and geolocate these hundreds of thousands of measurements. And our pilot study has implications for the way we assess air pollution exposure risk and how we go about designing policy to mitigate these exposures.
It's very interesting that you say that. So would you say that from your pilot study, you were able to pinpoint the occurrence of these environmental racist policies or issues occurring within the IE? Were there patterns of mobility or economics that helped influence this? I know you mentioned residential areas. Was there anything else that you saw that impacted this?
So as this was a pilot study, we didn't have enough data to generalize as far as mobility is concerned, but we are able to identify points of interest that may be high risk for certain individuals. And once we expand our GIS-based analysis to include more participants, we'll be able to actually identify these high-risk locations, whether or not these are voluntary trips or whether they're involuntary trips, like where you go to work, okay? So also, relatively speaking, while my research mainly focuses on air pollution and exposure disparities, I think it's fairly apparent from anecdotal evidence and from our own personal observations of the continued expansion of warehousing in the IE, um, that there are environmental justice issues here. Okay, so much of the Inland Empire, while there are more at-risk communities than others here, but much of the Inland Empire is at risk for disproportionate environmental hazards because the land is cheap, and it's plentiful compared to that in the coastal communities, okay? And so this is very attractive to industrial developers, particularly Amazon. So with this continued expansion of warehousing, as well as rezoning of parcels to support this industrial development, this is contributing to an increased risk for vulnerable communities.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to point out that residents are actually fighting to slow these projects or reverse these decisions to rezone the parcels, but the concerns are oftentimes ignored at the city or the county management level, and they vote in favor of this rezoning and this development in and around communities that are traditionally residential. So with that, I think research is definitely needed to provide the data-driven evidence of these racial disparities in warehousing development, but it's pretty clear from anecdotal and just private observation that these things are happening in the Inland Empire.
Yes, and it's unfortunate, and I know it's a topic of conversation among students, and I know faculty, UCR, we're very focused on our community and research within our community, so we're finding these disparities. Unfortunately, the Inland Empire is not unique to issues of environmental justice or environmental racism, from the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 to wildfires here in California. It has been proven that racial and ethnic minorities face greater vulnerability to health and economic disparities, as you were mentioning earlier. It is an issue affecting communities across this nation as well as across the world. Can you think of any policies that should be or can be implemented to address and even prevent environmental racism?
Well, absolutely. I think one of the main policy mechanisms that can be implemented when it comes to preserving the environmental sustainability of an already at-risk neighborhood is to have an environmental equity assessment. So not only do we have NEPA, which requires that an environmental impact assessment be conducted for new developments, we actually need to have an additional policy to assess environmental equity. That means we need to assess the history within that location of disproportionate environmental impacts. And before a project is allowed to progress, if that score is too high, if the environmental injustice burden is too high for that community, it should weigh heavily on the decision whether or not to move forward with a project. I think that's a really important policy that may need to be enacted. So not only do we need to protect endangered species, but we need to have some sort of environmental equity assessment that takes into account historical burdens on a community.
Yes, as I continue my education, equality has been a word, just from the Declaration of Independence that I've always known, but equity is just as important, if not more important, in knowing the difference and acting on equitable, efficient, and effective solutions. That has been one of my greatest takeaways from being a public policy student, and I wish more people would look into equity. And I do think that for every policy, but as you just mentioned, within the environment, it should be equitable, and we should look into that. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Your research is so important, and it's helping people right here, right now, and it will, help shape policies of the future, and what policymakers. I love that the data driven, that is so important, that we look at factual data and make plans based off of that. So you are such an important step in that process. So thank you so much for talking with us. This is such an important issue, and I'm glad we got to learn something and share this with our audience.
Thank you both for having me. It was my pleasure.